everyone, welcome back. So my name is Maggie Allen. I'm Special Projects Lead at Autistica. Absolutely delighted to be with you all today. We had a fabulous session this morning on healthcare, and I hope that you were able to join, and if you did, you were able to have a good lunch break as well. So whilst we can't hold an in-person poster session like we've done at previous live events, we still wanted to share our emerging work in autism research. So this session will be a mixture of video poster presentations and image poster presentations. We'll start with the video presentations, and then we'll move through to the image presentations. So you'll be able to download all of these and look through these poster presentations in a PDF format, following the link just above this live stream. We won't be hosting a live Q&A session today. However, we do know that it's important for you to be able to ask questions to the authors. And that's why you can still do this by posting your questions in the Q&A box below, and the authors will be replying to you in the same Q&A system. So without further ado, let's dive right into these poster presentations and move on to our first poster. This is with Valeria discussing development and validation of a self-report measure on monotropism in autism.
Hello everybody, I'm Valeria. I'm a master's student at the University of Edinburgh, and welcome to my talk about developing and validating a novel self-report measure of monotropism in autism. So first, as a bit of background, monotropism is an interest-based model of the mind according to which different strategies are employed by autistic and non-autistic people to distribute attention. It's theorised that autistic people have the monotropic tendency to be pulled in more strongly by their interests, especially emotionally speaking. And this then means that fewer interests are aroused at any given time, and they also use up more cognitive resources, such as attention. And this can then in turn lead to difficulties when interacting with stimuli that are outside of their attention tunnel or that threaten to disrupt it. And this theory has been embraced by the autistic community for a variety of reasons, including that it explains many aspects of their lived experience, and we'll hear a bit more about that later. So in this study, participants filled out an online survey consisting of 3 questionnaires. So our novel monotropism questionnaire, which consists of 47 items, which were crowdsourced by a group of autistic people based on their lived experience. And then participants also completed the RADS14 and the AQ10 so that we can see how their monotropism scores compare to scores on pre-established autism measures. So participants were mainly recruited through social media, and overall we collected data from 756 autistic participants and 354 non-autistic participants. So we're very excited to have such a large sample, but we asked ourselves why so many people responded to the survey on social media, and we'll now hear a short response first from Richard Woods and then from Fergus Murray, 2 of our autistic collaborators on the project.
Yeah, the study means a lot to me, and I'm grateful to Valeria and Sue for collaborating on the study. I, like many autistic persons, I'm passionate about the theory. We tend to view it as having the best explanatory value present of the extant autism theories, mainly as it intrinsically views as being fully human, as is in line with social model neurodiversity values, and also to honour the legacy of Donna Murray.
There are a few factors at play, but I think the main one is that we've had 3 decades of autistic people hearing about monotropism and saying, wow, this theory describes my experience far better than any of the alternatives. And we've had 3 decades of nobody in the psychological establishment trying to test its predictions or validate it. And we've had 30 years of people putting it into practice and making good use of it to understand autistic minds and work out how to work with us. So seeing somebody finally do some empirical research to start to test its predictions is huge.
So in terms of results, we found that autistic participants had significantly higher mean monotropism scores of 4.15 compared to non-autistic participants who had a lower mean monotropism score of 3.1. So this is visualized a bit better in this plot. As you can see, the autistic participant group in green had higher scores, and the scores also deviated less from the overall mean score compared to the non-autistic group. And next, we also found that having ADHD significantly predicted an increase in mean monotropism scores of both autistic and non-autistic participants by 0.56 points, with the highest scores being observed in autistic participants with ADHD, who had a mean score of 4.21. Again, this plot visualizes the results a bit better, so we can kind of see how the mean monotropism score become gradually lower between autistic participants with ADHD at the highest end and participants without autism and without ADHD at the lowest end. And this project is still underway and some further analyses are planned, so if you'd like to know more, do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Valeria. And so great to see social media being so effective in recruiting a subject population. So over to our next speaker, Holly, discussing her poster titled Investigating the Accuracy of People's Judgments About Social Dyads, Autistic Diagnostic Status from Videos of Social Interaction.
Hi, I'm Holly Sutherland and I'm an autistic PhD student at the University of Edinburgh studying social communication and autism. This presentation is about some data analysis I did, looking at how successful autistic and non-autistic observers are at guessing whether people in videos and photographs are autistic or not. Half the observers, or raters, that we recruited for this study were autistic, and half were non-autistic. We showed these raters videos and pictures of two people having a conversation. In a third of the stimuli, both people were non-autistic. In another third, one person was autistic and the other was non-autistic. And for the final third, both people were autistic. Because of the limited number of participants and stimuli in this study, it's important to note that our results are descriptive only. First, we looked at raters' performance with the videos. Autistic and non-autistic raters seem to perform very differently. For non-autistic pairs, non-autistic raters performed best. Autistic raters often incorrectly guessed that both people were autistic. But for mixed pairs, autistic raters performed best, far better than non-autistic raters. By looking at just the data from mixed pairs, we can see that this difference was mostly driven by non-autistic raters, assuming that the autistic person wasn't autistic. And finally, whilst all raters performed worst with autistic pairs, autistic raters also outperformed non-autistic raters here. Whilst autistic raters performed at chance, non-autistic raters performed well below chance, often guessing that both people were non-autistic. Secondly, we looked at raters' performances with the photographs. Overall, all raters were more likely to guess people were non-autistic than in the video condition, as we can see by slightly improved performance for non-autistic pairs and much worse performance for autistic pairs. Additionally, a lot of differences in performance between autistic and non-autistic raters were flattened. Autistic raters are still slightly worse with non-autistic pairs and slightly better with autistic pairs, but the differences are a lot smaller. If we take those small differences though, along with a zoom in on the mixed pairs, there does still seem to be evidence of what we saw in the video study. Autistic raters are likely to incorrectly guess non-autistic people as autistic, and non-autistic raters are likely to incorrectly guess autistic people as non-autistic. So, in summary, both autistic and non-autistic observers can often guess whether someone is autistic from photos or videos of them interacting. And it seems to be a lot harder to tell that someone is autistic when they're interacting with other autistic people. Additionally, autistic and non-autistic observers display different patterns of guessing, especially in the video condition. This may suggest that autistic and non-autistic observers are using different cues when guessing whether someone is autistic or not. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and thank you to my funders, my collaborators, and the study participants.
Thank you, Holly. So thank you for a fascinating study looking at perceptions of autistic people from observing interactions. So we're now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Emma, who is discussing autism research, looking for answers in the wrong places.
Hello, my name's Emma Reardon and I'm a PhD researcher exploring how using autistic lived experience can influence outcomes in autistic people's lives. Most of the research about autism in the UK focuses on the biology, causes and treatment of autism, and this research often looks inside of autistic people like me to find out what's going on, or as it feels to many of us, what's wrong with us. But this research isn't what autistic people, our families and the professionals that support us think are the most important research topics relating to autism. The priorities of the autism community are about mental health and better opportunities in work, education and housing, and getting better support. In excess of £10 million was spent on UK autism research in 2016, and globally research budgets run into billions. Yet no matter how much we know about autism, autistic people are still experiencing poor outcomes. So perhaps the issue is not about something that is wrong with autistic people, but something that is wrong with the way autistic people are perceived and consequently treated. Is all this focus on biological and genetic factors relating to autism the best direction for research? I don't think so. Mental health is the #1 research priority for autistic people and their families, and this isn't surprising when you consider the poor outcomes autistic people experience in our lives. So why is only 3% of autism research across the globe focused on mental health? Some good news is, according to Autistica, 9 out of 10 autistic people want to participate in research. So we know the autism community's priorities in autism research, and we also know that autistic people want to take part in that research. So how do we make things happen? Inclusivity isn't just about accessibility. Inviting people who've experienced the stigma and invalidation of being autistic to the research table needs to ensure they feel safe once they arrive. Simply providing people with accessible formats or asking their opinion is not enough. People who lack agency in their daily lives will need tailored support and understanding to empower them to take part, or else our actions as researchers will be purely box-ticking or tokenistic. And there are members of the autistic community, such as those of us who are older or have a learning disability or are situationally non-speaking, that are underrepresented. And we also need to consider the cultural differences in the way autistic people use body language, gestures and interpret questions. And we need to analyse data with a genuine understanding of what it means to be autistic and not just a knowledge of what autism is. This presentation and poster reflect my personal and professional perspectives, and I'd like to share some links to relevant work I'm involved in. I was recently involved with a group known as the Global Autistic Task Force on Autism Research, and we co-authored an article that was published last month in the Autism in Adulthood journal. And I'll draw my presentation to a close with the final words of a blog I wrote. I believe it is time for researchers to collaborate with autistic people and together take a look outside of the bodies and brains of autistic people and into society to see how improvements can be made. Thank you.
Thank you for that excellent presentation, Emma. Great to see recognition of the importance that autistic people are included in the decision-making about autism research priorities, a subject that's very close to Autistica's heart. So now over to our next speaker, Ariana, with her poster that is titled, "I'm not mad, bad and dangerous, simply wired differently. A positive psychology exploration of quality of life of autistic women without intellectual disability."
Hi, my name is Ariana Parikos, and this presentation is on a piece of research conducted at the University of Manchester exploring the quality of life in autistic women without intellectual disability from a positive psychology perspective. We interviewed 10 autistic women regarding the factors they considered being key in achieving good quality of life and identified 4 key themes. The positive sense of self diagnosis was suggested to be important as this allowed the development of true self-understanding.
There are a lot of things that I sort of thought were my fault, and I was blaming myself for them, but then I realised there's an actual reason behind why I don't understand certain things. So that was like a massive weight off my shoulders.
This was also suggested to help good quality of life through enabling the identification of personal strengths and interests and aligning pursuits accordingly. The autistic community was considered to be important for feeling supported, as it enabled normalisation of typically pathologised behaviours, such as avoiding eye contact.
It's like coming home. It's like finding your people, you know? Suddenly people think like you do. You're not having to explain things to them.
This suggests that a paradigm shift towards a neurodiversity affirmative stance may aid the quality of life of autistic women through normalisation and acceptance of autistic traits. Many participants reported high awareness of their needs, interests and values and associated good quality of life with having the autonomy to create a life world that considered these needs.
The beauty of being autistic is that, like, if we enjoy something, we can really get into it. So I think it's just sort of nice to allow yourself to do that.
This suggests that current quality of life measures may not be accurately capturing the factors that are important to autistic women for their quality of life, as these may differ to non-autistic counterparts. All participants reported the importance of inclusivity for good quality of life, as this was said to reduce the pressure to assimilate to non-autistic norms and priorities.
It feels like I'm a left-handed person in a right-handed person's world.
This suggests that quality of life may be better conceptualised as the goodness of fit between the autistic woman and her environment, as opposed to her ability to cope in non-autistic spaces. There were several implications of the findings, the first being that a neurodiversity affirmative approach to assessment and diagnosis may aid improved quality of life for autistic women. Post-diagnostic psychoeducation for existing support networks and peer support through access to the autistic community was also suggested to improve feeling supported and thus good quality of life. We recommend further research from a positive psychology perspective in the area, with specific focus on underrepresented groups in autism research, such as those with an intellectual disability and those with gender minority identification. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ariana. Great to learn more about the experience of autistic women through this research. So now over to our next speaker, Lucy, with her poster that is about incorrect cutoff values in autism screening tools, the consequences for research and clinical practice.
Hi, I'm Lucy. I'm a PhD researcher at the University of Bath, and I'm going to discuss our research looking at an error in the AQ10 guidelines and the implications it may have had for psychological research. So as many of you may know, the 10-item autism spectrum quotient is an internationally used self-report measure of autistic traits, which is used in both research and clinical practice. It has been recommended by the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence as a screening tool to help clinicians decide if somebody may need a referral for an autism diagnostic assessment. We noticed, however, that for the last 9 years, NICE had incorrectly recommended a cutoff value on the AQ10 of greater than or equal to 7, rather than the correct cutoff value of greater than or equal to 6. While NICE have now changed their guidelines to the correct cutoff value, we also noticed that this error had proliferated into autism research, with over 50% of the studies we investigated having reported the incorrect or an ambiguous cutoff value. Given there is such prevalence of incorrect AQ10 cutoff use, we wanted to understand what the consequences of this may be for psychological research. To do this, we reanalyzed 5 open access datasets, using both the correct and incorrect cutoff values to divide participants into high and low autistic trait groups. By doing this, we could understand which cutoff value was more predictive of clinical diagnosis, where this information was available, and if a 1-point change in cutoff value could significantly change the effect size of autism-related associations. We found that the correct greater than or equal to 6 cutoff value was more predictive of diagnosis in 2 datasets, and that up to 56% fewer participants would meet the incorrect greater than or equal to 7 cutoff. We also found that effect sizes significantly changed by up to 60% when using the incorrect cutoff value compared to the correct cutoff value, and that associations also became non-significant. These findings suggest that incorrect use of the AQ10 cutoff can significantly change the interpretation of autism-related associations in research, which could in turn have implications for our understanding of autism and also the clinical interventions such research is used to inform. We consequently urge future research to use the correct cutoff value moving forward, and that studies that have used the incorrect cutoff value to be reanalyzed and corrections printed if needed. If you would like to hear more about this research, please have a look at our preprint, and thank you for listening.
Thank you, Lucy. A great example of the importance of research in informing correct cutoff values. So we're moving over to our next speaker, who is Sarah, with her poster titled Examining Language and Communication in Autistic People with Complex Needs, a systemic review of procedural and measurement issues and practice.
Hi everyone, my name is Rachel Davis and I'm going to be talking about our research looking at autism and bilingualism, a thematic analysis of practitioner perspectives and experiences. So parents are often concerned about the potentially harmful effects of bilingualism, and many autistic children are denied the option to access additional languages in or outside of the home, despite these concerns not being based on evidence. So there's currently no research addressing the perspectives of practitioners, who are crucial in supporting parents to make informed choices about bilingualism with their children. So the aims of this study were to understand the experiences of practitioners, and in particular we focused on better understanding barriers and potential facilitators to best practice. So we recruited 12 speech and language therapists based in the UK. We conducted semi-structured interviews, and our questions focused on attitudes and beliefs of practitioners. The questions for the interview were developed by the research team and in consultation with our stakeholder advisory board. And so for the results, we conducted a thematic analysis. We had 3 central themes arise from the interviews, and I'll go through some of the sub-themes now, but I can't cover them all, but they are all on the slides. So practitioners identified 2 parental concerns arising most frequently. First, whether growing up in a bilingual household could cause additional delays to their child's language or cognitive development. And they also described a common misconception that parents think that if they only spoke English to their child at home, they would automatically see improvements in their child's language skills. So the majority of practitioners discussed a lack of cultural diversity within the profession and described a lack of emphasis on cultural factors during their training period as a challenge when supporting some families. Some practitioners experienced difficulties distinguishing between behaviours commonly associated with autism and differences in cultural norms, and the majority stated that some of the materials and resources available to them are often culturally inappropriate. So practitioners overwhelmingly expressed their support for maintaining a bilingual environment, and it's clear their advice was never to recommend a monolingual environment specifically. Yet despite this support, the majority of practitioners shared uncertainties as to whether they were providing the right advice, and this was associated with a lack of evidence-based knowledge in the area. So this study highlighted the need for culturally relevant resources in clinical sessions, the fact that practitioners need to be provided with opportunities to receive up-to-date training and access key findings, and highlighted the importance of making accessible resources and information about autism and bilingualism for parents who don't have English as their first language. So as a result of this, my colleague Berengere Degar and I have co-produced some accessible guidelines for practitioners and parents. These provide an overview of evidence to date and are being updated as new research comes out. They've currently been translated into 10 languages and there are more to come, so please check out the link if you're interested. And thank you so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you to all the families who participated. Thank you to our advisory group. And please get in touch if you'd like more information.
So that was a fascinating study looking at language and the importance of being able to give resources in multiple languages. So we're now going to move on to our next speaker, who is Sarah. With her poster titled Examining Language and Communication in Autistic People with Complex Needs, a systemic review of procedural and measurement issues and practice.
Hello, my name is Sarah Donald and I'm a PhD research student at City University of London. My poster presentation summarises the initial findings from a systematic review I conducted titled Examining Language and Communication in Autistic People with Complex Needs, a systematic review of procedural and measurement issues and practice. The co-authors of this review are Dr. Sebastian Geig, also from City University, Dr. Anna Remington from the Centre for Research in Autism Education at UCL, and my fellow PhD researcher Nalini Edwards, who is also at City. This review is part of the Complex Needs Research and Development Project, which aims to make autism research more inclusive and representative of autistic people who have complex support needs. If you'd like to find out more about our work, please look out for my colleague Nalini Edwards' poster and also our panel presentation. We know that autistic people who have complex needs are underrepresented in research. Research tells us that approximately 50% of autistic people have intellectual disabilities and approximately 30% remain minimally verbal throughout life. However, only 2% of autism research focuses on this subset of the autism population. This means we know very little about effective ways to provide support for these individuals. The Complex Needs Research Development Project seeks to address this imbalance. It's funded by Autistica and is based on a joint application from the Complex Needs Study Group, which consists of researchers and community representatives. The aim of my review was to explore current research methodology and practice in relation to language and communication for autistic people who have complex needs. The key aims were to explore what strategies are used for engaging, recruiting and retaining autistic participants with limited speech and/or intellectual disability in research. What tools have been used with this population to capture language and communication skills, and how minimal language and intellectual disability are defined and operationalised within the research literature. It's important to note that I did not place an arbitrary limit or descriptor on what constitutes complex needs, as I wanted to capture as much of the available research as possible. Also, one of the things I wanted to explore is how these terms are actually operationalised and used. Therefore, the sample was defined according to the search terms. If a study used one of the descriptors in the second column to describe their participants, it was included. Research of all types were included, and measures of all types were also included. So things like proxy report or study-specific tasks were still accepted. Outcomes had to relate to an aspect of language and communication. After duplicates were removed, I had 4,064 studies, which were screened on title and abstract. 825 were screened on full text. I ended up with 203 papers. These represented 135 unique studies. This is a breakdown of how different terminology was operationalised. As you can see, there is quite a wide amount of variation. Terms like minimally verbal, non-verbal and non-speaking were most frequently defined according to the number of words a person uses, or through a descriptive account of how a person communicates. The amount of variation shows that the terminology used in the literature is not clearly defined or universally understood. 76 different measurement tools or approaches were used to characterise or define study samples. 30 of these were only used once throughout the literature. Figure 4 shows the frequencies of all approaches used 3 or more times as a function of terminology used to describe the sample. It's worth noting that only approaches used more than 3 times are shown here. Of the 10 most frequent approaches, only 5 use a standardised tool. Language function was often assessed in non-standardised ways, very frequently by manipulating or scaffolding the individual rather than adapting the measurement tool. This graph includes adaptation made to all measurement approaches, including non-standardised methods such as study-specific tasks. The yellow columns are examples of adaptations made to suit the needs of the individual, for example, providing regular breaks or a familiar environment. And the blue columns show adaptations where the individual was manipulated to suit the needs of the measurement approach. For example, things like discriminant reinforcement, ignoring of protests or unwanted behaviour, and hand-over-hand modelling. Despite attempts to highlight these issues in the existing literature, there remains little uniformity in approach to identifying, defining and operationalising language and communication for people who have complex support needs. Researchers predominantly rely on non-standardised approaches to measuring key indicators of language within this population. A significant proportion of researchers make adaptations to standardised tools in order to accommodate their participants' needs. But further analysis of this data is needed to identify patterns in these adaptations, and it's possible that this can inform development of more accessible standardised tools. The lack of reporting on methodological challenges such as recruiting and engaging participants makes it challenging to identify obstacles in this area or to determine best practice. Thank you very much for taking the time to listen to my poster presentation. If you'd like any further information about the review, please feel free to contact me by email, or you can visit our website. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. And there is information about this research study that Autistica is funding on our website, along with all our other studies that we are presently funding. So thank you very much to everyone who of our video poster presenters today. And we will now be showing the image poster presentations. Each one of these will be the same length on screen for 3 minutes. And you can download all of the posters you've seen today from our festival poster page.
So although we can't hold in-person poster sessions like we have done at our live in-person events, we still want to share emerging work in autism research. So in light of that, this session will be a mixture of video poster presentations and image poster presentations. So let's move on to the main event and on to our first poster. So first up, we have Holly, who will be exploring the autistic social communicative style. Over to you, Holly.
Hi, I'm Holly Sutherland and I'm an autistic PhD student at the University of Edinburgh, studying social communication and autism. This presentation is about a focus group I ran as part of my doctoral research to try and understand autistic people's perspectives on autistic social communication. We ran the focus group online over the course of 2 weeks using an anonymous forum-style setup. 9 autistic adults took part, and we had several topics that people could comment on: how they signalled social interest, what felt natural in social interaction, what made interactions enjoyable, and their experiences talking to other autistic people. Our participants had different experiences of attention, self, and their environment. Social interaction drained their energy quickly. They often struggled with various executive functioning related tasks like self-monitoring, managing behavioural responses, or staying focused on the conversation and not getting distracted or zoning out. Participants also felt they had a very fragmented internal experience, some of which was linked to masking, but which also included having different versions of themselves in different scenarios or environments, with little continuity in between. And, of course, there were also issues with auditory processing and sensory sensitivities. This led to different ideas about how social communication should work. Social interaction should have a purpose and be meaningful. Communication should be honest and direct. Boundaries and routines, far from being restrictive, provided a liberating scaffold to interactions. And, overwhelmingly, there was an emphasis on ideas of individuality, accommodation, and respect. Every person was unique, and so every new person had to be carefully learnt, every new relationship negotiated. In an unsupportive environment, where neurotypical people didn't understand autism, this led to communication breakdown. Participants felt like social interaction was dangerous. People might be unkind or aggressive to them, or they might accidentally upset someone. They struggled with neurotypical people being inflexible in their expectations of what social communication should look like, with neurotypical people's lack of directness and use of white lies or empty reassurances, and with sensory sensitivities in noisy, bright, busy social spaces like cafes. But in supportive environments, these differences didn't necessarily need to cause a problem. Participants finding out that they were autistic and discovering what this meant gave them the ability to explain and advocate for their needs. Having other autistic friends who instinctually understood these needs was good, but non-autistic friends who were understanding, willing to learn, and happy to meet participants halfway were just as good. In summary, autistic people experience their internal and external worlds differently. This leads to different ideas about how communication should work. When society is autism hostile and inflexible, problems occur. But when armed with self-knowledge and supportive friends, mutual understanding can be reached. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and thank you to my funders, my supervisors, and my participants.
Thank you, Holly. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for sharing. Now over to our next speaker, Emily, with her poster on rethinking fast and slow processing in autism.
Hi everyone, I'm Emily Taylor, a researcher at the University of Bath, and my poster presents some of my work examining dual processing in autism that was recently published in the Journal of Abnormal Psychology. So in psychology, dual process models suggest people generally engage in 2 types of information processing or thinking: intuitive processing, which is thought to be fast, automatic, and unconscious, and deliberative processing, which is comparatively slower, effortful, and conscious. A recent promising theory of autism suggests that autistic people, compared to non-autistic people, have increased propensity towards deliberative rather than intuitive thinking. This promising theory is thought to explain autistic people's difficulties, for instance, in making rapid intuitive judgments of social information, but also explains autistic people's strengths, such as more rational and logical thinking. However, research exploring the theory to date has been limited by a number of issues around measurement validity, the use of small underpowered samples which lack generalizability, and the lack of replication studies. So to investigate this theory further, we conducted 4 studies to re-examine dual processing in autism and addressing some of these issues. Specifically, we conducted 3 studies exploring the relationship between autistic traits and intuitive and deliberative thinking, and a 4th study directly comparing 200 autistic and 200 non-autistic adults. All participants completed well-validated cognitive and self-report measures of intuitive and deliberative thinking, as well as a measure of general cognitive ability. Across the studies, we saw an identical pattern of results, so here I'm simply presenting the study comparing the autistic and non-autistic adults. And we found after accounting for general cognitive ability, there were no differences between autistic and non-autistic adults in deliberative thinking on both the cognitive and the self-report measures. We also found no differences on the cognitive measures of intuitive thinking. However, autistic people did self-report lower levels of intuitive thinking. Together, we interpret these findings as challenging the dual process model of autism, with more evidence of similarities between autistic and non-autistic people than differences. As such, we caution against the practical applications of the model. In light of these findings, we would also suggest that identifying and highlighting the similarities between autistic and non-autistic people may be an important way to refine future psychological theories, but also to improve attitudes towards autism. Nonetheless, moving forward, it would be important to explore the reasons for our discrepant findings from the objective and subjective measures of intuition, which may perhaps be underpinned by the terminology used in the self-report tool. I'd like to finish by thanking my collaborators on this project. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Emily. That was absolutely fascinating. Next up, we have our next speaker, Linda, with her poster titled "They Obviously Think We're Misfits," exploring the narrative experiences of parents of children with autism and learning difficulties and their perceptions of societal attitudes to autism. Over to you, Linda.
Hello everyone, my name is Linda Smith and I am a PhD researcher at the University of Birmingham. And my research concerns the lived experiences of parents of autistic children who also have learning difficulties and sometimes other co-occurring conditions, and these parents' perceptions of societal attitudes to autism. I also have a personal connection to autism as I have an autistic son who also has learning difficulties. This is an overview of my research. The context to my research in the first box, number 1, is that there is very little research, very little understood about the experience of parents of autistic children who also have learning difficulties and other co-occurring conditions. Secondly, there's very little known about how this group are affected by societal attitudes towards autism. However, what we do know is that the issue of attitudes, negative attitudes, is an issue that continues to persist in society and has significant impacts on these families and their children and the way they live their lives. So I've tried to lay the poster out in a logical way. So number 2 gives you the aims, number 3 gives you the methodology and conceptual framework, and number 4 focuses on the findings, and number 5, the implications. One of the key findings related to parents' experiences of grandparents, both their unsupportive and supportive attitudes. And this is a particular key finding. And in the centre of the poster, I've provided a visual which gives you the themes that emerge from the research about unsupportive and supportive attitudes. So in the red, you've got themes that were unsupportive attitudes, and in the green, you've got themes that were supportive attitudes. And in some cases, these work as sort of inverses of one another. So while some of the research emerged which indicated that parents experience a lack of understanding of autism, at the same time, from other people in other contexts, they experienced supportive attitudes with a lot of understanding of needs. I'm happy to answer any questions, and my contact details are on the front of the poster. Please do feel free to get in contact. And thank you very much for reading and listening to my poster.
Thank you, Linda. That was absolutely phenomenal. Next up, we have David, who is going to be exploring the working experiences of autistic adults. Over to you, David.
Hello, my name is David, a PhD researcher at Heriot-Watt, and my research is investigating the autistic experience of employment. What my poster is showing you is what I have found through my systematic search and review, where I've analysed and discussed all published papers that include the first-hand autistic experiences of employment. The 33 papers found contain hundreds of experiences that I believe can be explained through 6 prevalent themes and factors. Firstly, the environment. It was shown that many autistic individuals are sensitive to various aspects of the physical environment, such as sounds, lights, and temperature. The workplace environment goes beyond the physical, however. The most discussed experiences were ones regarding the level of acceptance. Furthermore, the environment also includes the type of job one might do. For example, job roles with clearly defined tasks led to a more successful work experience. The individual's unique social profile also factors into the workplace experience. Many felt that social experiences were considered too important in employment and would have preferred to be judged by their skills instead, putting social experiences as reasons for failure. While some did enjoy social experience or even sought them out in order to develop their skills, the majority still felt drained by these, reiterating their importance into the overall experience. Many felt anxiety in the workplace, all due to their work, and the experiences that cause that are important to understand. Additionally, other individual factors influence the success of other employment experiences, such as the individual's skill set being utilised correctly, or how executive functioning may hinder a work success. One of the most important experiences were the difficult conversations an individual has in order to acquire adjustments in the workplace. These conversations are disclosure and the actual requesting of adjustments. Why an individual engages or does not engage in these conversations is important to understand. Unfortunately, it was very common for an individual to experience stigma and discrimination following disclosure, and the fear of this often led to non-disclosure. As mentioned throughout, the attitudes of others are incredibly important through the work experience. Facing discrimination and outright bullying is unfortunately common for autistic individuals in employment. Whether that's from colleagues or from their superiors, these experiences must be acknowledged and the actions must be taken to mitigate these. Finally, we look at how these experiences can be improved upon. Factors that make a better workplace are often discussed within our other experiences. Whether these are things that have been successfully implemented or simply desired, it is important to understand what experiences led to work success. These 6 experiences and the interplay between them make up the autistic experience of employment. Through understanding what makes up employment experiences, perhaps we can find ways to improve upon it, capitalizing on positive aspects and mitigating the negative. This research is part of my wider thesis that hopes to dissect the autistic experience of employment, and I hope I can share more of this with you in the future. Thank you for your time.
Thank you so much, David. That was really insightful. Now over to our next speaker, Emmy, who joined us earlier this week in our panel discussion on eating and diet, which you can watch back on Austica's YouTube in the coming month. Her poster is titled Sensory Processing and Eating Behaviours in Autism, a Systematic Review. Over to you, Emmy.
Hello, my name is Emmy Nimbley and I am a second-year PhD candidate at the University of Edinburgh. This is a poster presentation of my recently published systematic review, conducted with Lisa Gold, Helen Sharp, Fiona Duffy and Carrie Gillespie-Smith. Following studies that reported aversions based on sensory-based features or aspects of food in autistic children, it has been hypothesized that differences in sensory processing may be an underlying mechanism for observed eating behaviours in autism. Several recent reviews have begun to explore whether sensory processing is correlated with eating behaviours. However, these reviews have limited their scope through their focus on narrow statistical measures of effect and their focus on childhood only. This review therefore aimed to identify, evaluate and synthesise empirical literature regarding the following question. Is there a relationship between sensory processing and eating behaviours across the lifespan? Adhering to the updated PRISMA guidelines in 2020, the current review searched published and unpublished literature, looking for studies that reported a measure of effect between sensory processing and eating behaviours in community or clinical populations with a diagnosis of autism. Following a rigorous screening and selection process, 26 papers reporting on 25 studies were included in the review. The results were then synthesised according to three main eating outcomes: mealtime behaviours, food repertoire, and food neophobia. Careful consideration was given to eating behaviour categories, following previous criticisms of heterogeneity and inconsistency of terms, as well as the neglect of autism-specific behaviours in eating measures. The review found that sensory processing was consistently associated with eating behaviours across all three broad eating outcomes. Furthermore, eating behaviours were indicative of a multisensory experience, with taste and smell sensitivities notably implicated. Hypersensitivities were also tentatively implicated. However, this was a limited evidence base, with only one study including hyposensitivities as well in their analyses. No single study looked at disordered eating as an outcome, which is somewhat surprising given the increasing literature support and overrepresentation of eating disorders in autism, and recent evidence to suggest that tailored eating disorder interventions that account for differences in sensory processing is effective for autistic individuals. Several limitations were observed across studies, including a lack of controller comparison group, unrepresentative samples, and an over-reliance on cross-sectional designs and parent report measures. Furthermore, there was a notable lack of attention paid to different sensory patterns, which intuitively may lead to different eating behaviours. For example, hyposensitivities may lead to overeating, while hypersensitivities may lead to restrictive or avoidance-based eating. Please see my poster for a summary of directions for future research across conceptual considerations, research design, measurement and assessment, and the development and implementation of interventions. Thank you for listening. I look forward to discussing my review more in depth and addressing any questions.
Thank you, Emmy, for that really insightful piece. So now over to our last speaker, Julie, with her poster on understanding educational experiences, autistic students' engagement with in-person and remote learning. Over to you, Julie.
I'm Julie Bailey from the University of Cambridge Faculty of Education, and we're looking today at the results from our study on autistic students' engagement with their learning, both in person and remote learning. For this study, we used existing ideas and frameworks around engagement, where engagement is seen as divided into four components, where we look at different aspects of the learning experience across behavioural, emotional, cognitive and social engagement. And we worked with autistic students to identify within these components what would be the most meaningful and the most relevant subconstructs. Interestingly, we found that emotional aspects of engagement were particularly important. So we use these lists of words, these subconstructs, as our way of measuring the quality of the engagement of students with their learning in different contexts, so in different types of learning. And alongside that, we very simply ask about engagement rating, just a 1 to 5 rating. How well did you find that learning worked for you? So when we used this measure that we developed, we found that there was a difference between the autistic students and the comparison group in the way that they reported their engagement. Simply looking at the ratings, we were finding lower reported engagement from autistic students than the comparison group. And when we looked at these statistically, we found that these were significantly lower for pre-recorded lectures and then for small group and one-to-one learning, both in person and remote. So we looked more closely at those types of learning with the engagement subconstructs. And what we found is starting to build a picture of what might be happening here. So for autistic students, they were reporting being distracted during their experience of pre-recorded lectures, much more frequently than the comparison group, and then much lower ratings of being satisfied with their learning than the comparison group. And some other differences starting to emerge, higher levels of reporting of overwhelm and lower levels of reporting of independence. So starting to build a picture of what might be happening here. When we looked at small group teaching, we saw that autistic students were reporting concentrating far less often than the comparison group, but frustrated far more frequently than the comparison group. And interestingly, we didn't find any difference in the social aspects of learning between autistic students and the comparison group. So our very simple measure is starting to help us to understand what might be happening here, the differences that might be affecting students' engagement with learning. So you can find out more by looking at a poster and also by looking at the project, and we've got a link here to the website.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you to all of our video presentation posters. They were all absolutely fantastic. So that's all the video posters for today. Thank you for listening and engaging with the authors in the Q&A system below. We'll now be showing the image poster presentations.